You pull into the parking lot in a car you can't quite afford, wearing a watch you financed over 18 months, carrying a bag you paid off in 4 installments. Everyone assumes you're doing well. You are not. You are
Oh,
$30,000 underwater and quietly terrified someone will notice. 2 spots over, a man gets out of a 10-year-old Toyota. Same 3 t-shirts on rotation. Nobody looks at him twice. He is worth $5 million. This is the strange, upside-down relationship between money and how loudly you show it off. The less you actually have, the harder you tend to work to look like you have it. And the more you actually accumulate, the less you feel any need to prove it to a stranger in a parking lot. Why does flexing peak early and then quietly disappear the richer someone gets? In 1899, an economist named Thorstein Veblen published a book called The Theory of the Leisure Class. He coined a phrase that every marketing department on Earth still uses without crediting him: conspicuous consumption. Veblen's argument was simple. When your status isn't secure, you signal it. You buy things not for what they do, but for what they broadcast to the people watching you. 100 years later, the mechanism hasn't changed. Only the props have. It used to be a carriage. Now it's a leased German sedan. Here's the part most people miss. Conspicuous consumption isn't really a wealth behavior. It's an insecurity behavior, and insecurity about money runs highest exactly where you'd expect. At the bottom, and in the middle, where status is genuinely fragile and genuinely up for grabs. So let's walk through what this actually looks like. Level by level, around $30,000. Whether that's your income, your savings, or your net worth after debt, you're sitting in what's sometimes called the visibility trap. You don't have much room to save, but you have just enough access to credit to look like you do. Financing makes almost anything purchasable, even on a low income. So the instinct kicks in. Buy the appearance of security, because you can't yet buy the real thing. A car loan buys a nicer car than your paycheck justifies. A credit card buys a vacation your savings account can't. This is the level where flexing is loudest, because the gap between how you want to be seen and how exposed you actually are is at its widest. Meve up to somewhere between $100,000 and $300,000 in net worth, and the flexing doesn't disappear. It gets more selective. This is usually the first stretch where someone has real assets. A mortgage that's actually shrinking, a retirement account that's finally compounding, maybe a small investment portfolio. But it's also the range where people get the most anxious about losing what they've built because they remember exactly what it took to get here. So the spending gets smarter, not smaller. The car gets nicer, but now it's paid off. The vacations get better, but they're funded by credit card points instead of debt. The flex is still there. It's just wearing a disguise called "I earned this." Somewhere around $1 million in net worth, something genuinely shifts. This is the range Thomas J. Stanley and William Danko wrote about in their landmark study, The Millionaire Next Door. Published in 1996, Stanley and Danko surveyed real American millionaires. Not celebrities, not heirs, just ordinary people who had quietly crossed 7 figures. And found something that surprised almost everyone who read the book. Most of them didn't look rich at all. They drove used cars. They lived in the same modest house for decades. Plenty of their neighbors had no idea they were millionaires. The core finding was this: people who look rich are usually spending their income to appear wealthy, while people who are actually wealthy are usually underspending their income to stay that way. Visible wealth and real wealth, it turns out, are often inversely related. Let's actually walk through what that $1 million shift looks like in a real life. Not just in a survey. Take someone who spent their 20s financing the $30,000 version of themselves. The car, the watch, the vacations on a card. At some point, usually in their 30s, the math catches up. The minimum payments stop feeling like progress and start feeling like a leash. So they do something almost boring. They pay off the card. They buy a used car in cash. They max out a retirement account instead of a shopping cart. Nobody claps for this. There's no photo to post of an index fund quietly compounding in the background while you eat dinner at home, instead of a restaurant that photographs well. For years, it looks like nothing is happening. Then, one day, the account crosses a number that used to feel abstract, and the strange part is that almost nobody around them ever finds out. That's not an accident. That's the pattern Stanley and Danko documented. The compounding happens exactly during the years when a person has stopped performing wealth for an audience. By the time someone crosses into the multi-million-dollar range, call it $5 million and up, the behavior doesn't just quiet down. It often reverses completely. The financial journalist Robert Frank spent years covering America's wealthiest households for the Wall Street Journal and later CNBC, and documented this exact pattern in his book, Richistan. Frank found that once people reach a certain level of real wealth, many of them actively work to hide it. They use trusts and LLCs to keep their names off property records. They drive ordinary cars on purpose. They avoid the exact brands and behaviors that used to signal success, because at that level, visible wealth doesn't earn respect. It attracts liability. It attracts lawsuits. It attracts relatives asking for money. It attracts salespeople treating you like a target instead of a person. Frank called this pattern stealth wealth, and the phrase stuck because it describes something real. At the very top, invisibility becomes the actual status and symbol. Picture the shape of that curve. Near the bottom, flexing is a survival strategy, a way of borrowing status you can't afford yet. In the middle, it becomes a reward system, proof to yourself that the sacrifice was worth something. Near the top, it flips completely, and hiding wealth becomes the smarter financial decision, because attention has turned from an asset into a liability. Here's the counterintuitive twist. Most people assume rich people flex more because they simply have more to flex. The data says close to the opposite. The Federal Reserve's survey of consumer finances has shown for years that households with the highest net worth typically hold a smaller share of it, invisible assets like cars and clothing, and a much larger share in things nobody can see walking past them on the street. Index funds, business equity, retirement accounts, real estate held through an entity with someone else's name on the paperwork. Wealth, once it becomes real, moves underground. Financial insecurity, when it's being covered up, moves above ground. Onto your body, into your driveway, where everyone can see it. This is also, in a strange way, a psychology story as much as a money story. Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist who won a Nobel Prize for showing how people actually make financial decisions, instead of how economists assumed they did, described loss aversion as one of the most powerful forces in how humans handle money. We feel the pain of losing status more sharply than we feel the pleasure of gaining it. Flexing at the lower levels is loss aversion in action. It was never really about winning admiration. It's about avoiding the specific, sharp pain of being seen as behind. Now, bring it back to you. Not the version of you at $30,000. And not the version of you at $5 million. The version of you right now, today, in whatever range you're actually in. Ask yourself honestly, is the next purchase you're planning going to build something? Or is it going to be seen by something? A watch that shows up in your net worth 10 years from now is a different object than a watch that only shows up on your wrist tonight. A car that gets paid off behaves differently, over time, than a car that gets financed just to look paid off. Asking that one question every single time before you spend is the actual mechanism that moves someone from the loud end of this curve to the quiet end of it. It's worth naming the thing that makes this harder today than it was in Veblen's time, or even in 1996 when Stanley and Danko published their research. Back then, conspicuous consumption required a physical audience, neighbors, co-workers, people at a dinner party. Now the audience is permanent, and it fits in your pocket. Every purchase can be photographed, posted, and judged by thousands of strangers before you've even finished paying for it. That doesn't change the underlying psychology Kahneman described. It just gives loss aversion a bigger stage and a faster feedback loop. The pressure to look like you're winning didn't get smaller in the age of social media. It got louder, and it got harder to opt out of, which is exactly why the people who do opt out of it, who stop financing the performance and start building the account nobody sees, end up standing out precisely by disappearing. There's a reason people who study wealth keep landing on the same conclusion from different directions. Veblen from economics, Stanley and Danko from survey data, Frank from a decade of reporting inside rich households, Kahneman from the psychology lab. They're all describing the same curve. The people flexing the hardest usually have the least room to lose. And the people with the least left to prove are usually the ones who quietly stopped trying to prove it years ago. You pulled into that parking lot today, in a car you can't quite afford, hoping someone would notice. The goal was never to make people notice you. The goal was to get to the point where you don't need them to,